Healthcare providers are supposed to be trusted members of the society. You don't really go to your doctor or go to the hospital and think, is someone going to kill me here? But you better think twice, because hospitals can be under investigation and you would have no idea that this was even happening or that it was affecting you in any way until it had already happened. Hi, my name's Yasmin and I make videos about topics that are scary, disturbing or true crime, so if you'd like to, then please subscribe and give the video a thumbs up and we'll get on with the rest of the story. Niels Högel was born and raised in Wilhelmshaven in Germany to a very Catholic family. He had a pretty idealistic home life as a child. Both of his parents were educated and had stable jobs. His mum was a paralegal and his father was a passionate nurse who followed the footsteps of his own mother, who was also a nurse. Niels and his older sister got along very well, and there weren't any domestic violence issues in the house. There was no abuse of any kind in their household. It was all just quite the opposite, really. He was brought up in a very sheltered environment where his parents actively put measures in place to protect their children and keep them out of harm's way just in general. The stability of their home life was reflected in his schooling as well. He had lots of friends, he was known to be the class clown, and Niels loved all the positive attention that he would get from his peers, but things started to change a little bit when his perfect family fell apart. So just as Niels hit the age of around 11 years old, so around puberty, a very sort of significant age for your mental development, his parents unexpectedly got a divorce, and this seemed to impact Niels' grades and school performance pretty significantly. But it didn't really stop him from following his father's footsteps in the future and becoming a nurse after he dropped out of high school. One of Niels' first jobs was at Oldenburg Hospital, which is where he worked in the intensive care unit, and he found that working in ICU was extremely rewarding because these patients were so unwell, and he was able to provide his help, his expertise, and display his nursing skills quite frequently because of how sick these patients were. But when he joined the ICU at this hospital, there was a very high rate of deaths and resuscitations at this stage. And they just kept occurring, but no one really knew why it was happening. The faculty came under fire because this ward consistently had much higher rates than any other ward in the hospital, and it remained quite high for 2 years. The staff at the hospital were at a complete loss. They had no idea what was causing this to happen. For 2 years, having these alarmingly high levels of deaths and resuscitations was just unacceptable. The board of the hospital did end up having a meeting at the end of that 2 years and found that since Niels worked so frequently, he was actually present for 58% of the resuscitations and deaths that occurred. So they actually thought it would be a good idea to approach him and see whether he knew anything about this because, he worked so much at the hospital that he knew the staff, he knew all the protocols of everything. He would have just been a good person to just, bounce ideas off of. But this actually ended up giving Niels quite a bit of anxiety. He was already developing a little bit of anxiety in his personal life as well, and he was developing a drinking problem at this stage. So when he was approached about this, it sort of tipped him over the edge, and he ended up taking 3 weeks off work sick. During that 3-week time frame though, there was a little dip in deaths and resuscitations that were occurring in ICU, although this could have been to chance because they were changing some of the protocols that were happening in the hospital, so it probably had nothing to do with Niels in the first place. But because of this, on the off chance that it did, they actually said to him that when he returns, since it's such an intense environment for him, that he should change wards. When Niels returned back to work, all fresh, he now joined a new ward, and this was the anesthesiology ward. This was a much calmer environment compared to the ICU, so it wasn't really common for patients to be in a life or death situation as much. Pretty soon after joining though, the head physician at the ward noticed that Niels would prefer to go on night shifts, and he would always be present if there was any life-threatening emergency or situation that the patient had a higher chance of dying in. And it was thought that this was happening because he was so used to ICU and he had a lot of experience in this field, but it happened time and time again, enough to form a bit of a pattern. In a single shift one day, there was 14 resuscitations with 5 deaths, which is an astronomical amount for this hospital. The clinic leaders did pick up on it and they gave him 2 options. They said either he was to transfer wards, but this time he was going to go to the logistics ward, which was more like an orderly role, which is where you transfer patients from one ward to another. So you don't really have much of a medical involvement with these patients. Or he was asked to just leave the workplace in general, but he was given 3 months worth of pay. Niels was really upset by this because he wanted to become a nurse to help people. He wanted to deal with patients face to face. And what was the point of doing this if he was just in the logistics ward where he wouldn't actually get the chance to even talk to the patients that much in a day? So he actually found that, the best option for him to do was to leave this hospital. So he resigned from Oldenburg Hospital. It wasn't long until Niels started his new position at Delmenhorst Clinic. But the same thing started happening there. The death rates and resuscitation rates just rose significantly since his arrival. They found that patients were dying mainly from arrhythmias, which is an irregular heartbeat, but also just cardiovascular issues in general. This time though, there was a clear association with Niels and the deaths and resuscitations that were occurring. So much so that the staff members just started to keep their distance from him a little bit. And the part that baffles me the most is that the fact that senior doctors and nurses were all well aware of this and they had their suspicions, yet no one took the initiative to get this investigated further and actually figure out what was happening to cause these patients to die out of nowhere. There would be patients that would come in for non-cardiovascular related issues. So for example, this actually did happen. Someone came in for a gastrointestinal issue and he just suddenly, out of nowhere, developed a heart attack. Now, he had no prior risk factors for developing a heart attack. It just seemed completely random that he got this before he even entered surgery. It just didn't make sense. But it was clear that Niels was on shift whenever these things happened. These patients would have serious cardiovascular events and go into cardiac arrest, and Niels would just happen to be there to resuscitate them and bring them back to life. In one instance, a patient was resuscitated by him 1 week apart from each other, so the patient actually died. He was resuscitated, then a week later, he died due to failed resuscitation. And on both of those occasions, Niels was present. Some colleagues found 4 empty vials of a drug named Ajmaline the day that Niels was on duty. Ajmaline is a medication that's most commonly used in emergency medicine, and it's to reduce a fatally elevated heart rate or to diagnose something called Brugada syndrome, which is when people develop life-threatening arrhythmias or they develop sudden cardiac death. So in other words, it's not something that you use on a regular basis in any old ward. So why were there 4 empty vials of it? None of the doctors on duty had even prescribed this medication during the time period that Niels was working there. It did take years, but in 2005, Niels was caught injecting a fatal dose of Ajmaline into a patient's medical pump. Finally, they had some solid evidence and police were brought in for a thorough investigation. But due to the negligence of the hospital staff, Niels was actually able to murder so many vulnerable patients, way more than they actually know. 73% of all the deaths that occurred within the ward of the clinic that he last worked at was linked to him in one way or another. His sentencing initially was a little bit of a slap on the wrist. He was sentenced for 5 years in prison with temporary suspension of his nursing license, which is ridiculous because he was a serial killer. His conviction was appealed and reversed because it was just deemed too light. And it was exchanged for a 7.5-year sentence with his nursing license permanently revoked, which I still feel like wasn't really enough. In 2014 though, he did end up confessing to 3 lives that he had taken and that he attempted to kill 2 other people. As time went on though, he confessed to another 30 patients, and an in-depth investigation was done by police that concluded that he actually poisoned 90 patients but was able to resuscitate 60 of them. The more time police spent investigating, the more patients came to the surface and were obviously poisoned by him. By the end of 2014, they estimated a minimum of 200 patients that were a victim to his crimes, and he most likely killed even more patients than this. Due to his confession, he was actually given a life sentence. So, I guess, why did he do it? This is actually a very complex question though, because they believe that Niels had an obsession with being seen as a hero and showing off his nursing skills to his colleagues. He loved the praise that he gained from bringing patients back to life after a near-death experience, and it gave him this feeling of power and dominance. But it all really came down to his ego. He was just proud to be a good nurse, and he wanted to showcase his skills, which resulted in hundreds of patients being senselessly murdered at the hands of a supposedly trusted healthcare professional. That was the story of Niels Högel. If you found that interesting, then please subscribe and give the video a thumbs up. I post every single week, so I will see you in the next video. Bye.